I'll never forget the way my heart broke that night, like it was a piece of glass thrown on the floor in front of everyone. My daughter was turning 30, and I had been waiting for this day, convinced it would be a celebration where, finally, she would recognize everything I did for her. I dreamed of hugging her, of hearing a "thanks, Dad," that would, in 1 second, repay me for so many sleepless nights, so many long days at the shop where my back ached from the years, but I endured it all because I believed it was worth it. I walked into the banquet hall, decorated with bright lights, tables full of flowers, and glasses that reflected the glow of the chandeliers, and I thought this was a setting worthy of seeing us smile together. But what happened that night wasn't a party. It was my public execution. It all started with a toast. She, my little girl, because to me she always will be, even if her lips spit venom at me, took her glass delicately and walked to the center of the room. Her eyes were shining, her dress sparkled, and the crowd of guests looked at her with admiration. I was waiting to hear my name, even just a simple mention, maybe a gesture of gratitude. I leaned forward in my chair, my heart racing, waiting for her to say the word "Dad." And then, with a wide smile and a firm voice, she pointed to her father-in-law, that man, Richard, with his expensive suit and that arrogant look, and she wrapped him in a hug. "This is my real father," she said, with a confidence that made my blood run cold. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but for me, it was an eternity. And then, like a wave crashing down without mercy, came the roar of applause. Everyone, absolutely everyone, clapped. Some stood up, others smiled like they were in on it, and I felt the floor vanish from under my feet. I sat there, frozen, the glass in my hands, watching the scene as if it wasn't my own life. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't process that the daughter I raised with my own 2 hands, the one I fed, clothed, and educated, would give herself over to another man's embrace like that, publicly denying I even existed. The worst part wasn't the applause or the laughter or the eyes that avoided mine as if I were a stranger at my own daughter's party. The worst part was when she turned her head toward me and without blinking said out loud, "Dad, you can go now." Her voice had no trace of affection, not even respect. It was an order, cold, cruel, delivered with the kind of chill you'd use to sweep a lifetime of memories out the door. I just sat there, not reacting, hoping she'd correct herself, say it was a joke. But she didn't. And then the laughter from some of the guests filled the void, like knives twisting in my chest. I stood up slowly, what little dignity I had left trembling in my hands. I felt all eyes on me as I walked to the door. Some looked away in shame, others watched me with contempt, as if I were some pathetic figure that needed to be erased from the perfect picture of the party. As I walked, the memories started flooding in. The first birthday I threw for her with just a few bucks to my name, the new shoes I bought her when I couldn't even afford my own, the nights her fever kept me up, praying to God he wouldn't take her. All of it was burning inside me while her words, those damned words, echoed over and over. This is my real father. When I reached the door of the hall, I stopped for a second. I wanted to turn around, to confront her, to scream the truth at everyone, the truth of who I was, what I had done, and how no one there would have ever seen that woman become an adult if it wasn't for me. But I held back. There was something in her look, that mix of contempt and satisfaction, that told me if I spoke, she would only laugh harder. And so I decided to stay silent, because I understood there was something else behind her gesture, something I couldn't explain right then, but it was burning like a secret. The night didn't end there. As I crossed the threshold, still hearing the echo of applause and laughter, I heard the squeal of the microphone. It was my son-in-law. His voice rose, strong and trembling, cutting through the noise. "That's enough," he said, and the murmur of the guests died down. I, with my hand still on the doorknob, froze. I heard him take a breath and add, "There's something you all need to know, something that will change this story forever." And then, without meaning to, I was forced to stop, because what he was about to reveal was so big that no heart, including mine, was prepared to hear it. That was the real beginning of it all. Not my humiliation, not the hug with the imposter, not the laughter. The real beginning was my son-in-law's voice, booming through that hall like thunder, announcing that the truth was about to come out, even if it destroyed us all. The hug I saw that night wasn't an innocent gesture of affection. It was a gut punch, a public stripping of my role as a father. While my daughter wrapped her arms around that man, her father-in-law, the imposter, the entire room erupted in applause. Her hands, which were once so small they fit inside my own calloused fingers, were now clinging to another man's neck with a devotion she never offered me. That image is burned into my memory like a cursed tattoo. It was as if, with that one hug, she erased me from her history, as if she rewrote our entire life in one fell swoop, handing over all the years of sacrifice I had given unconditionally to a total stranger. What tormented me most in that moment wasn't the gesture itself, but the way she said it, with those words that rang out like a death knell. This is my real father. Hearing them, I felt something inside me tear, like an organ being ripped out without anesthesia. It wasn't just an insult, it was a denial of everything we had shared. The little girl who once called me daddy, with eyes full of light, who would run to hug me when I came home tired from the workshop, had become a woman capable of tearing my fatherhood away from me in front of hundreds of witnesses. And the worst part was the joy in her smile, as if that humiliation gave her pleasure. The imposter, that arrogant father-in-law Richard, smiled, pleased. His eyes shone with superiority, as if he'd won a silent battle he'd been waging against me for years. He never said it to my face, but I always knew. He looked at me with disdain. He saw me as some blue-collar guy, working class, unworthy of being a father figure in my daughter's life. I saw it in his gestures, in the way he'd correct her words with fake politeness, in the way he always found excuses to overshadow me at family gatherings. And that night, with that hug, he got what he wanted, the title of real father, stolen right in front of my eyes. As the applause grew, I found myself replaying scenes from the past like ghosts. I remembered when my daughter was little and afraid of thunderstorms. I'd hold her tight against my chest. Her tears would soak my shirt, and she'd tell me, "You're my hero, Daddy." I remembered when she learned to ride her bike and fell, scraping her knees. I ran to her. I picked her up and encouraged her to try again. "I trust you, Daddy," she told me then. And now, at that party, facing that applause that felt like 1,000 tiny cuts, I understood that those words had died long before I ever noticed. The hero had become the villain, and the imposter was sitting on my throne. The crowd was enjoying the show. Some looked at me with pity, others with indifference, but most were clapping enthusiastically. They were witnesses to a betrayal, and instead of being outraged, they celebrated it. I felt ashamed, but also an indignation that burned my skin. How could they applaud? Did no one see what was happening? Was a father's love so disposable that it could be replaced during a toast? No one defended me. No one interrupted the scene. And right there, I understood that loneliness isn't just about being alone in your house. It's about being surrounded by people who choose not to see your pain. The imposter stood up and returned the hug with theatrical flair. His wide arms wrapped around my daughter solemnly, and his smile widened as he heard the applause. He seemed to be enjoying the spotlight, as if this was his true moment of glory. I wondered how many years he had been waiting for this moment, how many whispers he had planted in my daughter's ear to convince her that he was more of a father than I was. Because this betrayal wasn't born overnight. It was the result of something deeper, something I had overlooked, trusting blindly in a love that I now discovered was never guaranteed. My daughter looked at me for a second. It wasn't a long look, just a flash of her dark eyes meeting mine. But in that second, I knew she had done it on purpose. She wanted me to be there to see her replace me, to see her proclaim it in front of everyone. That look was the seal on the betrayal. There was no hesitation, no remorse, just a cold, almost cruel pride. And in that gesture, I understood that what I was seeing wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a final judgment. I sat back down, even though inside I was shaking like a man about to collapse. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me weak, even though every fiber of my being wanted to scream. I gripped the edge of the table, breathing deep, and silently promised myself that this humiliation would not go unanswered. If she had decided to embrace the imposter and deny me publicly, then I too would have to make a decision. And that decision, I could already feel, wouldn't be one of forgiveness. It would be one of justice. Because a father can endure ingratitude in silence, he can forgive private offenses. But when his name is torn from him in public, in front of everyone, what's born isn't just pain. It's a wound that demands a response. And I, from that moment on, swore I would give one. The laughter. I can still hear it. It doesn't matter how many days pass or how many nights I try to get to sleep. It always comes back, like a cruel choir mocking my memory. The sound of 400 hands clapping, of glasses clinking, of people laughing has become an echo that haunts me. When I close my eyes, the laughter doesn't die. It multiplies, it warps, it mixes with voices from the past. It's as if the world decided to join in on the joke, as if I were the clown on a stage I couldn't escape. And there I was, a 60-year-old man, turned into an object of ridicule by the person I loved most, my own daughter. I remember clearly the moment she pointed at me and said, "Dad, you can go now." She didn't say it with affection or even neutrality. It was a cold order, practically spat out in the middle of the hall, and the people, instead of being outraged, instead of reacting to the cruelty, laughed. It wasn't the laughter of surprise or discomfort, it was the laughter of complicity. It was as if everyone had been waiting for someone to get rid of me, as if I were an intruder. That's the image that torments me, the applause mixed with ridicule, the sound of my expulsion being celebrated like a spectator sport. I stood up, my dignity in shreds, trying not to show that I was falling apart inside. Every step I took toward the door was followed by that echo of laughter. I felt eyes on me, some looking with contempt, others with indifference, and a few with a pity that was even more humiliating. I walked slowly, because my legs felt like stone, as if my own body was resisting leaving its daughter, even though she had publicly rejected me. And as I walked, memories of my life with her piled up in my mind. It was as if my heart, wounded and bleeding, was trying to remind me of everything I had done, a last desperate attempt to convince me this couldn't be happening. I saw in my mind the first time I took her to school. I remember her in her uniform, too big for her little body, with her hair braided by her mother and her backpack hanging off her shoulder. I took her hand, and she, nervous, squeezed my fingers tight. "Don't let go, Daddy," she told me, and I promised her I never would. Now, decades later, she was the one who had let go, not of my hand, but of my entire heart, and she had done it with the coldest contempt. I felt my broken promise weighing on my shoulders like a sentence. Every laugh that echoed behind me was a reminder of my forgotten sacrifices. I remembered when she got the chicken pox, and I spent nights awake, changing her fever-soaked sheets while her mother slept, exhausted. I remembered the days I worked overtime to buy her a dress she wanted, and how her eyes lit up when I gave it to her. I remembered her first bike, the trips to the park, the hugs when I got home from work, all the things that were treasures to me, but to her were just rocks tossed in a river of forgetting. And the echo of laughter told me it had all been for nothing. I reached the door, but I didn't go through it right away. I put my hand on the handle and stopped. For a moment, I thought about turning around, facing them all, and screaming the truth. I wanted to tell them who I was, what I had done, what it had cost me to raise her, what it meant to me to be her father. I wanted to reclaim my place. But I didn't, because I understood that nothing I said could erase what they had already seen. Her words had been more powerful than any defense I could offer. I had already been condemned, and the applause was the judge's gavel sealing the sentence. And then, something unexpected happened. Just as I was about to leave, I heard the feedback squeal of the microphone. A voice rose above the noise, and the murmur died. It was my son-in-law's voice. "Enough," he said, his tone booming through the room. His firmness was like a lightning bolt splitting the air. I stood frozen, my hand still on the door, not daring to take the final step. I turned my head slightly and saw him, standing, his face serious, his eyes blazing, the microphone shaking in his hand. The hall, which seconds before was a party of laughter, fell into a dead silence. "There's something you all need to know," he continued. His words were a prelude, a bell announcing that what was coming wasn't just any revelation, but something that would change everything. The guests put their glasses down. The musicians lowered their instruments. My daughter looked at him bewildered, and I, paralyzed, understood that this moment would be the real breaking point. The echo of laughter died, and in its place, a heavy silence full of expectation was born. And I knew that what I was about to hear wouldn't just change my life, but the lives of everyone there. The entire hall was silent. It wasn't a respectful silence or an uncomfortable one. It was the tense silence of people who sense something is about to explode and can't look away. My son-in-law, still holding the mic, looked at the guests as if he were in a courtroom. His eyes were steady, but his breathing betrayed him. You could tell this decision hadn't been easy. I watched him from the doorway, halfway out, and for the first time since I walked into that hall, I didn't feel invisible. All eyes were no longer on the imposter my daughter was hugging. They were on this man who, against all odds, had decided to speak. "Enough applause," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "There is something you need to hear. Something that will change what you all believe." A murmur tried to rise from the crowd, but he raised his hand, and the silence returned. I could see the confusion on my daughter's face. Her lips parted to protest, but he didn't give her the chance. He continued, with a force that seemed fueled by years of buried truths. "This is not her real father," he said, his voice breaking. But he wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing at her father-in-law, Richard. The whole room held its breath. "And you know it," he added, looking directly at some family members who nervously looked away. I felt the air leave my lungs. What was he saying? What secret was he holding back, about to burst? My daughter, nervous, stepped toward him. "Stop it, please," she whispered, but the microphone caught her plea, and the guest's murmur turned into a wave of shock. He didn't look at her. He kept going. "I've been quiet for too long. I've watched this man, with his money and his sweet talk, win a place that doesn't belong to him. I've watched him plant poisonous ideas in your mind, making you believe your father was an obstacle and he was the real one. But tonight, I'm not going to let that lie be repeated." A collective gasp went through the room. The imposter, Richard, his smile still frozen, slowly got up from his seat, trying to keep his composure. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the confidence in his voice was failing. My son-in-law, looking at him with a mix of fury and determination, shot back, "Yes, I do, and if I don't speak up now, you'll end up destroying this family." I felt my legs shaking. Was it possible that this man had been working against me in the shadows even more than I had imagined? Was it possible that all my daughter's contempt had roots in words planted carefully over years? The idea turned my stomach, but at the same time, it gave me a strange sense of relief. It hadn't all come from her. There was someone else behind it, manipulating, feeding that scorn. My son-in-law lowered his voice, though the mic amplified every word. "I heard the conversations myself. I heard how you talked about Frank." My God, he used my name. "About you, Dad," he said, looking at me. "Saying he was a washed-up old man, that he was useless, that he was only good for putting up money. I heard you poisoning my wife, telling her she shouldn't feel grateful, that everything she had was nothing compared to what you could give her. You built this farce. And tonight my wife repeated your words as if they were her own. But no. Tonight, I won't let you hide behind her voice anymore." The room was a silent battlefield. No one moved. The imposter stood up, his face pale, trying to shake his head in denial. But it was too late. The seeds were exposed to the light. My daughter put her hands to her face as if she suddenly understood the scope of what was happening. And I, from my place at the door, felt an even deeper pain. Because what my son-in-law was saying might be true, but it also meant that my daughter had chosen that poison over my love. He finished with a sentence that still rings in my ears. "Your father is standing right here, humiliated because of you. And if you have any decency, you should be begging him for forgiveness, because this man," he said, pointing at me, "is the one who gave you life. The other one just stole your memory." There was a dead silence after those words. No one dared to clap. No one moved. My daughter, caught between tears and fury, was paralyzed in the middle of the room. The imposter collapsed back into his chair, unable to meet anyone's gaze. And I, my hand still on the door, knew that what had just happened was only the beginning of a storm that would tear us all apart. As the echo of my son-in-law's words still rang in my ears, my mind started to rewind, as if the painful present was forcing me to find answers in the past. At what exact moment did my daughter's path twist? Where did the bond I thought was unbreakable finally snap? Because no one is born hating their father. No one comes into the world with contempt already planted in their heart. Hate, indifference, disdain, all of it is cultivated, like a weed that someone waters day after day until it takes over the whole garden. And so I began to review my daughter's childhood, not with the sweetness I used to, but with the painfully open eyes of someone who finally understands that every gesture, every word, every omission was a brick in the wall that now separated me from her. The first image that came to mind was of her, just 3 years old, playing on the living room floor while I finished fixing a broken door. I remember she came over and clumsily tried to hand me a nail, imitating my movements. Her little eyes shone with pride, thinking she was helping me. I picked her up and sat her on my knee, telling her, "You're my best helper." Her laughter filled the room. In that instant, I was sure our bond was eternal, that nothing and no one could break the tenderness of those years. But now looking back, I wonder, when did that light go out in her eyes? When did I stop being her hero and start being her burden? The answer perhaps was in small episodes that, at the time, I didn't know how to read. I remember when she was 7 and came back from her mom's parents' house saying, "Grandpa says you work too much and Mom would be better off with another man." I froze. I answered her calmly, trying to deflect her words, but that sentence stayed with me like a thorn. It was an early seed of doubt, of mistrust in me, planted in the mind of a girl too innocent to defend me. I didn't see it then, but now I understand that those kinds of comments weren't isolated. They were constant drips, a silent drip, drip, drip that, over the years, formed a river that dragged her away from me. There was a day when she was 12 that she came home from school crying because she didn't have brand-name sneakers like her classmates. I, on a tight budget, had managed to buy her a sturdy pair, good for running and playing, even if they didn't have a famous logo. That night she looked at me with red eyes and said, "I wish Mom had married someone who could give me what I deserve." I didn't understand where those words were coming from, but they stung like a whip. I smiled, trying to hide my hurt, and promised her I'd get her those sneakers soon. I worked overtime, cut back on my own needs, and in the end, I bought them. She smiled when she tried them on, but that day I knew something had changed. My sacrifice wasn't enough anymore. It had become an obligation I had to fulfill to be considered worthy of her love. When she became a teenager, the distance grew more obvious. She didn't want me to drive her to school anymore. She was embarrassed to be seen with me. She said I smelled like varnish, sweat, and sawdust, and that her friends had fathers who wore suits and ties. I heard her laugh about my calloused hands when I tried to brush the hair from her face, and I accepted it, believing it was just a phase. I thought every teenager rejects their parents at some point, and that later, when she grew up, she would learn to value what I'd endured. But no. What I thought was a phase was actually the beginning of a one-way street. There were moments of tenderness, of course, moments when it seemed like the little girl who called me a hero came back. There were nights she asked me to read her stories, even when she was older, and I did it gladly, because in those stories, it felt like we reconnected. There were afternoons she showed me her drawings and said, "Look, Dad, this is you in your workshop." I kept every piece of paper like a relic. But now that I think about it, those moments were like sparks in the middle of a thunderstorm, flashes that went out way too fast. College was the final blow. She chose an expensive degree at an institution where appearances mattered more than knowledge. I sold my tools, took out a second mortgage on the little I had, and went into debt that was drowning me. But I never told her because I didn't want her to think she was lacking anything. And yet, instead of thanking me, she started comparing me even more to her father-in-law, Richard, who gave her luxuries and trips. One day, with a coldness that froze me, she said, "He supports me more than you do, even though he's not my real father." That phrase paralyzed me. I just stared at her, not understanding, because I had never once doubted my paternity. Where did that idea come from? Who had planted that poisonous doubt? It was in that instant, remembering it now, that I understood my daughter hadn't seen me as a father for a long time. To her, I was a walking ATM, a man who was supposed to give, shut up, and disappear when I didn't fit into her world of appearances. And every memory of sacrifice, of devotion, of love, now turned into proof of my own naivety. I myself had built the foundation of her ingratitude. I gave her so much that I taught her to believe it was all hers by right, and others, from the shadows, finished convincing her that I was never enough. The deception didn't start at that party, or even in her teens. The deception was crafted from her childhood in every poisonous word, in every unfair comparison, in every luxury I couldn't provide. And the most painful part of all is that I, with my silence and my sacrifice, helped build that foundation. My love became her weapon to despise me. And that night, when I saw her hug the imposter and deny my name, I understood that what had happened was the result of years of carefully constructed deceit. There is a shadow that never leaves me, even though she no longer walks this earth, the shadow of Teresa, my wife, my daughter's mother. Her absence weighs as much as her presence did in life. And sometimes I think that, even though she's gone, she's still speaking through my daughter. Because every word of contempt I received that night at the party, every arrogant look, every rejection, reminded me of her, of Teresa. When I met her, she was a young woman of quiet beauty, with an air of dignity and a strong character that dazzled me. I was just a kid with rough hands, with more dreams than certainties, and I looked at her like she was a miracle. I had no riches to offer her, just a steady paycheck and an uncertain future. But I did have an unconditional love that burned in my chest, and I thought that would be enough. How naive I was. Teresa always wanted more than I could give, and although she hid it at first behind smiles and caresses, over the years she began to show that what I offered wasn't enough. Our marriage was marked by silences that hurt. She never insulted me openly, never disrespected me in public. But her every gesture, every quiet comment, slowly pushed me into a corner. I remember when money was tight and I'd come home exhausted from the workshop, she'd say, "I just wish you could offer your daughter something more, not just effort." That phrase, repeated in different ways, was like a constant hammer blow. I would stay quiet, believing that silence was the best way to keep the peace, but what I didn't understand then was that while I was quiet, my daughter was listening. She heard every one of those phrases and stored them in her memory. There were nights we argued in low voices, thinking she was asleep. Teresa would blame me for not taking a job with her brother-in-law, who offered me a desk job, even if it meant giving up my workshop. "We'll never get ahead with your pride," she'd say. I would defend my passion, the work of my hands, but in my daughter's eyes, I must have looked like a stubborn man, incapable of giving them the status Teresa craved. Without realizing it, my daughter was learning that her father was synonymous with limitation, while other men, in suits, with money, with influence, were synonymous with power. I remember one scene that haunts me now. My daughter was about 10. She had gotten an outstanding grade in school, and I congratulated her enthusiastically, promising to take her to the park to celebrate. But Teresa took her in her arms and said quietly, thinking I couldn't hear, "I wish your father could give you something better than a walk in the park." That phrase fell like poison into my daughter's heart. I saw it in her eyes. The excitement for the park vanished instantly. And that day, I understood that my love, as pure and honest as it was no longer enough for her. Teresa's death didn't change anything. Or rather, it changed everything, but for the worse. Because when she died, I thought my daughter and I would get closer, that we would unite in our grief and, together, rebuild our lives. But the opposite happened. Her absence became a constant echo of her reproaches. My daughter would repeat her mother's phrases as if they were gospel. Sometimes, without looking at me, she'd murmur, "Mom always said you didn't know how to dream big," or "Mom always said we deserved better." Every word was a dagger. Because it didn't just hurt me, it reminded me that even in death, Teresa was still poisoning the relationship between my daughter and me. Teresa's shadow became a ghost in our house. In every important decision, my daughter would wonder what her mother would have thought, and she rarely consulted me. When she met her current husband, I remember her saying, Mom would have been so proud that I chose someone like him. And I, though it hurt, said nothing. I was already used to being the second stringer, the one who was there out of obligation, not by choice. Now, remembering all this, I realized that the humiliation at her birthday party was just the culmination of a process that began long ago. Teresa, with her words, with her discontent, planted the idea in my daughter that I wasn't enough. And even though she's gone, her voice is still alive in my daughter's memory, transformed into contempt for me. The shadow of Teresa is still with me today, dark and cold, like a sentence that never ends. That night, when I saw my daughter hug her father-in-law and deny me, I felt it wasn't just her rejecting me. It was Teresa, from the grave, laughing at me one more time. The man my daughter called her real father was nothing more than an imposter in a careful disguise. I've watched him for years, always in silence, always from the sidelines, like a wolf stalking the flock, waiting for the moment to attack. His name is Richard, but in my mind, I've christened him something else. The fake father. Not because he took my place innocently, but because he did it with premeditation, with calculation, with the kind of coldness only men who are used to gaining ground on others without anyone noticing the invasion possess. Richard appeared in my daughter's life as a kind presence. At first, he was the polite man who treated her with attention, who gave her compliments, who made her feel part of his family as if he were adopting her. I saw him approach with flowers, with smiles, with flattering phrases, and my daughter, starved for that kind of recognition, soaked up every gesture like it was treasure. I tried to tell myself there was nothing wrong with it, that every father dreams of seeing his daughter loved by her husband's family. But there was something in his eyes that bothered me. That way, he looked me up and down, with contempt disguised as courtesy, as if every time he saw me, he was thinking, "You don't deserve to be here, I do." What began as small gestures of kindness grew in influence. Richard became her advisor, her confidant, the voice my daughter listened to with rapt attention. If I gave her advice, she'd question it. But if he said the exact same thing, she accepted it as absolute truth. Over time, she began to mention him in our conversations more than she mentioned her own father. Richard told me, until one day she told me directly, "Dad, Richard understands me better than you do." That sentence, which should have set off every alarm bell, just paralyzed me. Because I realized he wasn't just a father-in-law anymore. He had infiltrated the most intimate space of our relationship, displacing me without me being able to defend myself. Richard had a powerful weapon: money. While I struggled to give what I could with my labor, he showed up with expensive gifts, trips, dinners at elegant restaurants. My daughter, raised on my sacrifices, began to compare. She no longer saw the value of the overtime hours I worked to pay for her college. Instead, she was dazzled by the luxuries he could offer without effort, and Richard, aware of this difference, exploited it. Every gift from him was another brick in the wall separating me from my daughter. Every word from him was another drop of poison reinforcing the idea that I wasn't enough. I'm not saying it was all his fault. My daughter had the choice not to be seduced by that false shine. But Richard knew exactly where to attack. He knew about my past with Teresa. He knew the complaints she used to make, and he made sure to repeat them quietly until my daughter made them her own. Your father didn't know how to take his opportunities. Your father didn't know how to give your mother the life she deserved. Phrases I once heard from Teresa, now warped and coming from my daughter's lips. They weren't new words. They were echoes that Richard had revived, like embers he never let go out. I remember one day in particular. We had argued, my daughter and I, because she wanted a car that was way out of my price range. I explained that I couldn't, that I was still paying off her college loans. She cried, screamed that I always had excuses, and stormed out, slamming the door. That same week, Richard showed up with the car she wanted, with a giant red bow on the roof. The smile on my daughter's face when she got it was like a dagger in mine. He hadn't just stolen my place as provider, he had also turned my "I can't" into a confirmation that I was, in his eyes, a failure. From then on, Richard became the center of her gratitude. She called him an example. She presented him as a role model. And I, pushed further and further into the corner, watched my place crumble. Until the final blow came. That night, at her birthday, when she hugged him and named him her real father. In that instant, I understood that Richard hadn't won just with money or flattery. He had won with years of a silent war in which I, without realizing it, never stood a chance. I watched him as everyone clapped. His smile wasn't one of joy, it was one of triumph. He didn't need to say it. His eyes screamed it at me. He had achieved what he always wanted, to steal the most sacred thing I had, my daughter's love, and I, powerless, was a witness to my own defeat. But something told me this battle wasn't over, because while everyone was clapping, my son-in-law was holding the microphone, and his truth was about to bring down the castle of appearances that Richard had built. And I knew, in the deepest part of my soul, that the fake father's mask wouldn't hold up much longer. There's something that hurts more than an insult. It's discovering that the contempt wasn't born in an instant, but grew slowly, like a cursed seed someone planted in my daughter's heart, and that I, without realizing it, helped water it with my own silence, because no one goes from loving their father to hating him overnight. Contempt is cultivated. It's fed. It's strengthened with gestures, comparisons, and words that, drop by drop, shape the vision a child has of their parent. And in my daughter's case, that seed sprouted early, and I, blind with love, refused to see it. The first time I felt that distance was when she was just 13. She had argued with me because I couldn't buy her a designer dress her friends were wearing. She yelled at me, "You never have any money, you can never give me what I want." I just stood there, silent, not defending myself, my heart tight in my chest. I promised her I'd find a way to buy it, but I didn't do it right away. A short time later, I saw her wearing the exact same dress, a gift from Richard. Her eyes were shining, and as she looked at herself in the mirror, she muttered, "He knows how to take care of me." That phrase was a poison I never forgot. What were financial limits to me were proof of my failure to her. Her teenage years became fertile ground for that contempt to grow. When I scolded her for staying out too late, she'd reply that I didn't understand modern life, that I was an old-fashioned man. When I tried to advise her about a dangerous crowd she was hanging with, she accused me of being controlling and not trusting her. And every time she sought refuge, she ran to Richard, who, in a soft voice, would tell her the opposite of what I was trying to teach. And so, slowly, I became the strict, limited authority figure, while he became the understanding ally. What hurt most wasn't her rebellious words. Every teenager has those. But that her words were too adult, too calculated to be hers alone. They were learned phrases, repeated like lines from a script. I remember one time she screamed at me, "Mom always said you were happy to settle, and Richard thinks so too." I heard her, and I felt a pit open up beneath my feet. It wasn't her speaking. It was the voices of the dead and the living, conspiring against me inside her head. Still, I never stopped giving her what little, and what much, I had. I paid for her college, even as I was drowning in debt. I sold my own tools to cover her study abroad trips. I worked until my hands practically bled, so she would never lack for anything she asked for. But my sacrifice had no value anymore. It became an obligation. There was never a thank you, never a gesture of recognition. And the worst part was, when I did give her something, she'd compare it to what Richard offered. Always bigger, shinier, more expensive. My efforts always came in second place, as if they were just crumbs that barely did the job. Over the years, that contempt became normal. It became her way of talking to me. Phrases like, "You don't understand," or "I wish you were more like Richard," became common. I swallowed my pain. I convinced myself it was just youth, that time would open her eyes. But time only hardened her. And so we arrived, at that night, at that birthday party where, in front of everyone, she banished me from her life with one sentence. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the bitter harvest of a seed planted years ago. My daughter's contempt wasn't just born from her mother's influence or from Richard. It was also born from me, from my silences, from my concessions, from allowing others to take my place instead of defending it. I was too patient, too confident that love would cure everything. It doesn't. Love, when it's not defended, wears out. It gets twisted. And finally, it dies in the other person's mind. I understood that with brutal clarity that night. My daughter didn't hate me for what I did or didn't do. She hated me because she had learned to see me as the man who was never enough. And that vision, repeated year after year, had become her truth. I was no longer her hero. I was no longer her refuge. I was a burden she could do without. And when I saw her hug the imposter with such conviction, I understood that the seed had grown into a massive tree, its roots wrapped tight around her heart, a tree watered by Richard, fertilized by Teresa, and permitted by my silence. My daughter's contempt wasn't a sudden lightning strike. It was a fire that had been smoldering for years until it consumed everything that ever connected us. And in the smoke of that fire, I was left standing, reduced to ashes, but with a new flame starting inside me, the flame of justice. The murmur of the crowd was gone. The hall, which minutes before was a river of laughter, applause, and clinking glasses, was now silenced by the firm voice of my son-in-law. I had never seen him like this. He was always a reserved man, the kind who prefers to watch in silence rather than speak. Did I think he was a good guy? Yes, but I never imagined he would have the courage to confront his own wife and her family on such a brutally public stage. And yet, there he was, standing, mic in hand, trembling slightly, but with steady eyes, ready to say what everyone was afraid to hear. "This man," he said, pointing at me, "is not a burden, as some here have made him seem. He is the true father, the only one who deserves that name." The air was cut from the room. I stood paralyzed. No one had ever said those words in my defense, not like that, not with that force. People shifted in their seats, some uncomfortable, some surprised, some in disbelief. And then my son-in-law continued, his voice breaking, but without stopping. "What happened here tonight is a disgrace, and not just because of what was said to him, but because of what has been hidden for years. It's time you all knew the truth." My daughter shot up, running toward him. "Stop it, please, don't say anything," she begged, pulling at his arm. Her eyes were wide, as if she knew exactly what truth he was talking about. But he gently moved her aside and looked at her with a strange pain, like someone who loves another, but can't stand the lies anymore. "Forgive me," he said to her quietly, but the microphone picked up those two words and projected them across the hall. And in that instant, I understood that what was about to come out of his mouth wasn't just a defense of me. It was a confession that dragged him in too. He took a breath, closed his eyes for a second, and said, "Your father-in-law is not who he appears to be. He has manipulated your wife. He has planted doubt and poison in her heart, but that's not the worst of it. The worst part is that he hid a truth from her that changes everything. Teresa, your mother, and Richard, they had a secret relationship, and there is a chance that you are not Frank's daughter. You might be his." The impact was devastating. A roar of voices rose from the guests, shouts, gasps, disbelief. The hall turned into a mess of murmurs, and I felt the floor disappear from under my feet. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest like a hammer. I looked at my daughter. She was pale, her mouth open, unable to react. The imposter, Richard, tried to stand up, but his legs betrayed him, and he fell back into his chair, his face a mask of horror. My son-in-law didn't hesitate. I heard the conversations. Richard admitted it more than once, thinking it would never come to light. He said he had loved Teresa in secret, that he comforted her when Frank was working, that there were nights she wasn't alone. And although it was never officially proven, he always hinted that you, he looked at my daughter, could be his. The silence returned, heavier than ever. People looked at each other, unable to process what they had just heard. And I felt a dagger pierce my chest. Had my whole life been a lie? The little girl I held, the one I raised, the one I defended, wasn't mine? My hands were shaking. A part of me screamed it couldn't be true, that it was a cruel invention. But another part, the most wounded part, remembered all the times Teresa had looked at me with a strange silence, all the nights she stayed out late, all the vague words I never wanted to decipher. My daughter screamed then, tears in her eyes. "You're lying! That can't be true!" But her voice had no strength. It was a cry of desperation, not conviction. Richard, on the verge of collapse, tried to speak. That was many years ago. It didn't mean anything. But his words fell flat. No one believed him now. No one could save him from this revelation. And I, standing at the door, understood that this was the real reason for everything. That my daughter's contempt, her rejection, wasn't just born from Richard's poison or the comparisons with my poverty. It was born from something deeper, from the doubt planted in her own identity. If she had suspected her whole life that I wasn't her real father, then her rejection of me wasn't just ingratitude. It was the expression of a void that could never be filled. The hall descended into chaos. Some got up, outraged. Others left, muttering. Some tried to comfort my daughter, who had collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. And I, with my heart shattered, didn't take another step out. I stayed there, leaning against the door, my gaze lost. Because that night, I understood that I had lost much more than my daughter's respect. I had perhaps also lost the certainty of ever being her father at all. The silence that followed my son-in-law's revelation was the heaviest I have ever experienced. It wasn't the awkward silence of a social blunder. It was a dense silence, like a church after a sin has been confessed, a silence that hurt your ears and your soul. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew where to look. I, myself, standing by the door, felt trapped in a reality I couldn't comprehend. My old, tired heart felt like it was about to explode. Was it true? Was it possible my daughter didn't carry my blood, that my whole life was built on a lie? My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to stand firm. I couldn't let myself collapse in front of them. They had already humiliated me once tonight. If I fell, it would be the end of what little dignity I had left. I looked at Richard, that imposter, who had smiled at me so many times as if I were a ridiculous little man. I saw him slumped in his chair, his face wrecked like a thief caught in the act. His lips were murmuring excuses, but the fear in his eyes gave him away. There was truth in my son-in-law's words, a truth he never expected to come out. My daughter, on the other hand, was in pieces. I saw her fall to her knees, crying, shaking, not knowing who to look at. For a second, I wanted to run to her, to hold her, to comfort her like I did when she was a little girl afraid of the dark. But I held back. That hug wasn't mine to give. It didn't belong to me anymore. She had ripped me out of her life tonight, proclaiming another man as her real father, and now, faced with the possibility that this real father was her mother's lover, she was lost in a sea of doubt. The punishment was right there. I wasn't punishing her. The truth itself was tearing her apart. The guests shifted in their seats, some outraged, others morbidly curious. The scandal was too big. "Is it true what he's saying?" someone asked from the back, and the murmur spread like wildfire. Richard tried to stand up to defend himself, but he could barely stammer. That was years ago. Teresa, I loved her." His voice broke, and the room erupted in a chorus of whispers and gasps. There was no going back. The man who had stolen my place was left naked in front of everyone, his mask shattered. I watched him, and I felt no relief. There was no pleasure in his downfall. What I felt was a sadness so deep it consumed my bones. Because his defeat didn't erase my pain, it didn't give me back my daughter, and it didn't wipe away the years of contempt. The truth was a punishment, yes, but it was a punishment for everyone. For me, now doubting my own fatherhood. For my daughter, watching her entire world collapse. For Richard, exposed as the traitor he was. And for Teresa, who, even in death, would now be remembered not as a mother, but as an unfaithful wife. I forced myself to speak. I felt that if I stayed silent, I would be consumed from the inside out. I took a few steps forward. The murmuring died down. In a firm voice, I said, "I want everyone to hear something. I don't know if my daughter carries my blood or not. Maybe the truth has been hidden for years. But what I do know is that I was the one who raised her. I was the one who held her when she was a baby. I was the one who took care of her when she was sick. I was the one who sacrificed to give her a future. No one can deny me that. No one." My voice was shaking, but every word came out with a strength that surprised me. I looked at my daughter, who was crying on the floor, and I added, "If you ever find out that I'm not your biological father, you remember that blood isn't everything. Being a father is about being there. It's about giving. It's about loving." And I did that. Even if you reject me today, even if you deny me, nobody can ever erase that truth. The hall was absolutely silent. Some looked at me with respect, others with shame, unable to meet my gaze. I saw my daughter lift her face, tears streaming down her cheeks, and for just a second, I thought I saw the little girl who once called me her hero. But the flash was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by confusion and shame. The damage was done. That night, I learned something that will stay with me until my dying day. The truth is a punishment that doesn't ask for permission. It arrives when you least expect it, and it destroys everything in its path. It didn't give me back my daughter. It didn't give me comfort. It didn't bring me justice. All it did was leave everyone in that room in ruins. But in those ruins, in the middle of all that pain, I also knew I had gotten something back, something they had taken from me, my voice, my dignity. And even though every bone in my body still ached, I swore this would not be the end. The real punishment was just beginning. After that night, I sat for a long time in the darkness of my house, my soul in pieces and my body empty of strength. I'd close my eyes, and I'd hear my son-in-law's voice again, my daughter's scream, the guests' whispers, and above all, the revelation that changed everything, the possibility that she wasn't my biological daughter. That doubt pierced me like a red-hot poker. The question burned in me. Was she mine, or was she the product of Teresa's deceit? I could get a test, I could look for scientific answers, but I didn't have the courage. I was terrified the result would rip away my last shred of hope. And then I understood that my battle was no longer about whose blood my daughter carried. My battle was for something bigger. It was about reclaiming my dignity and getting justice for all the years I was treated as less than. In the days that followed, I thought a lot about what had happened. The public humiliation was a wound, yes, but it was also a spark. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for years of silence and sacrifice, woke up. A voice kept repeating, "Enough being quiet. Enough taking it." It was as if everything I had swallowed for decades was demanding to come to the surface, all at once, and I knew I couldn't let that revelation just fade into party gossip. No, this had to be turned into a final reckoning. I started planning calmly, like a craftsman building something step by step. The first thing was to organize my memories, my proof, my sacrifices. I dug out receipts, letters, photographs, documents that proved everything I had done for my daughter since she was born. I pulled the college tuition stubs from a drawer, the loan agreements, the overtime pay records. Every piece of paper was a wound, but it was also a testimony. I wanted to make it clear, to whoever needed to see it, that blood or no blood, I had been the only real father. The second thing was to investigate Richard, the imposter, the man who had gained ground behind my back until he'd stolen my daughter's affection. For years I had looked at him with silent contempt, but I never bothered to look past his mask. Now, it was different. I needed to know who he really was, to expose his secrets, to put him on display in front of the same world that applauded when my daughter called him father. I discovered that his fortune wasn't as clean as it looked. There were shady deals with suppliers, debts hidden under other family members' names, political favors that kept him afloat. I wasn't surprised. A man capable of stealing my place in my daughter's heart was also capable of corrupting everything else he touched. While I gathered information, I thought about my daughter, not as the woman who threw me out with contempt, but as the little girl who once hugged me, scared of the thunder. And then I felt something strange. I didn't want revenge on her. My daughter was a victim too, even if she didn't admit it. She had been shaped by the wrong voices, by the comparisons, by her mother's lies and Richard's manipulations. My justice wouldn't be against her. No. My justice would be against the man who dared to call himself real father, against the imposter who usurped what I had built with blood and sweat. The plan began to take shape. I couldn't do it by shouting or with violence. That would just make me look like a bitter old man. I had to be meticulous, precise, undeniable. The justice had to come disguised as truth, as proof that no one could argue with, and at the same time, it had to be public as the humiliation I suffered. Because what they did to me wasn't in secret. It was in front of 400 people, and the reparation, the revenge, had to be just as loud. One night, while reviewing the documents, I understood I had two weapons: the truth of Teresa and Richard's affair and the proof of his dirty business dealings. I could use one, I could use the other, or I could use both like a hammer to destroy him completely. But I was in no hurry. Haste is the enemy of justice. I wanted Richard to feel what I felt that night: the waiting, the uncertainty, the fear of not knowing when the blow would land. My son-in-law, the one who started the scandal, came to see me a few days later. I saw him arrive, his shoulders slumped, looking like he'd aged 10 years in one night. He apologized. "I didn't want to hurt you, Frank," he said, "but I couldn't stay silent anymore." I listened to him quietly, and for the first time, I looked at him with respect. This man, who had also suffered his wife's contempt, influenced by Richard, had shown more courage than I had. "You didn't hurt me," I replied. "You opened a door that needed to be opened." And from that moment, I knew I wasn't alone in this fight. He would be a key part of my plan. Weeks passed. The scandal faded into rumors, but I kept working in silence. Every day was another brick in the wall of my justice. I hired a private investigator, a discreet man who knew how to move in the shadows, to follow Richard's trail. What he found was worse than I imagined: hidden offshore accounts, kickbacks to local officials, properties bought using straw owners. It was an empire built on sand, and I had the wind in my hands to blow it all down. I won't deny there were nights I had doubts. I wondered if it was too late, if it was worth spending my last years on revenge. But every time I remembered the laughter of the guests, the cold look in my daughter's eyes when she threw me out, and Richard's victorious smile as he received that hug, the fire lit up again. It wasn't just for me. It was for the truth, for justice, for all the fathers who were ever treated like shadows. I decided on the place where my revenge would begin: the next family gathering, the very place where everyone thought appearances would win again. There, I would put the proof on the table. There would be no yelling, no insults, just documents, photographs, undeniable truths. I would make every person who clapped that day see the man they celebrated with their own eyes, stripped of his masks. And when the truth fell, there would be no going back. That night, as I went to bed, I thought about Teresa, about what she would say if she saw me now in this meticulous plan I was building against the man who was once her lover. Maybe she'd call me cruel. Maybe she'd accuse me of destroying her memory for our daughter. But I didn't care anymore. My whole life, I was the man who stayed quiet, who bowed his head, who endured. Not anymore. The humiliation at that party was the last straw. Now, I was going to speak, and my voice would be so loud that no one could ignore it. I chose the day and the place with the calm of a man who has learned not to rush. Revenge, I thought, must have the shape of truth and the precision of a Swiss watch. We called the family together under the pretext of a dinner to mend broken ties. "A chat to clear the air," I said in the invitation. No one suspects that clearing the air can turn into a storm that rips the roof off. The living room had the same carpet where birthdays and holidays had been celebrated. The photos on the wall looked at me like old witnesses. I had everyone sit around the long dining table. My daughter arrived, her eyes still puffy. Richard walked in, stiff like a man who knows he's being watched. My son-in-law, the man who set off the scandal and became my unexpected partner, sat next to me in silence. In my briefcase, I had the lab results, the recordings, the invoices, the wire transfers, and something more. The documents that proved the schemes of a man who had tried to usurp a name. I spoke of Teresa first, not to defend her honor, which couldn't be saved, but to remember that behind every lie there are broken childhoods and decisions made in the dark. I spoke in a steady voice about nights of high fever, of first days of school, of tools sold to pay for a semester of college. I looked my daughter in the eyes. I didn't accuse her. I invited her to look with me, to see the scattered pieces of a story someone else had tried to rewrite. Then, with that same calm, I began to lay out the proof. I showed messages, private conversations where his intentions were revealed, calls that hinted at agreements. I put down photographs of Richard at Teresa's apartment at odd hours. I listened as the room grew tense, like a bowstring being pulled back. The first blow wasn't a direct confrontation, it was playing a recording no one expected. It was Richard's voice, in a careless conversation, admitting he'd had a relationship with Teresa, that he had fanned the flames and planted seeds of doubt, that he had worked to push my name into the shadows. The recording played, clear, unedited, like a key opening a secret door. I saw his hands shake, his jaw clench. I saw my daughter turn pale, as if the floor was about to give out. I didn't feel joy. I felt a deep sadness. The fall of a man who thought he was invincible was giving me back years of being in the shadows, but it didn't fix anything I'd lost. The truth, even when it's powerful, hurts before it heals. Then came the envelope. I'd kept it like a talisman for weeks, the result of the DNA test that, with a mix of cowardice and hope, I had secretly ordered. That night, shaking, I opened the envelope and placed the paper on the table. This wasn't vanity. This was the cornerstone of my life. I read the words from the lab out loud, the numbers that confirmed what my bones and blood already knew in silence. Genetic match. Probability of paternity. 99.999%. My daughter heard me, not understanding at first. Then her hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes searched mine, asking a question that had no easy answer. The room broke into murmurs. Some relatives looked at each other, guilty, others shocked. Richard, disarmed, let out a sound that seemed like an apology to the empty air. Showing the DNA wasn't an act of pride, it was an act of reclamation. I wanted the truth to rest on irrefutable evidence, so no lie could ever stand against the weight of science. As the paper was passed around, I continued. I had saved the best and worst for last. The proof of Richard's financial web. The offshore accounts, the transfers that justified the gifts and trips, the fake contracts with suppliers who were then paid in cash. I wasn't talking about money out of greed. I was talking about the mechanism that turns affection into a transaction. I put invoices and bank statements in front of everyone, and I watched as the walls the imposter had built around himself cracked. My daughter couldn't take it. She stood up, walked a few steps, then turned, came back, and hugged me with the urgency of someone trying to repair a ruined landscape. "Forgive me, Dad," she said, sobbing. Her voice was a thin thread, reclaiming her childhood for just a second. It wasn't a complete apology. She wasn't asking me to forget the damage. She was asking for the truth that would free her from the weight of doubt and pride. I felt her against my chest like a small resurrection. I took her hands. They were cold. I spoke to her with the simplest truth. I was the one who raised you. Nothing can ever erase that. I didn't know if my words were enough. I didn't know if time could repair what was broken. But in that hug, I knew we had found a starting point. Richard tried to save his honor with clumsy excuses and calculated gestures. His family tried to make offers, to discuss compensation, to fix it, as if the damage could be paid off with money. Many relatives looked away, ashamed. Others whispered that the family would never be the same. But my goal was not to destroy for destruction's sake. When I finished laying out the truth, I proposed a path, a way for the damage to have, at least, constructive consequences. I offered that the assets that could be claimed, the funds recovered from his irregularities, be put into a trust, to fund a trade workshop for young people and to create scholarships in memory of what Teresa and I were never able to offer. I didn't want senseless revenge. I wanted to transform the scandal into restoration. The decision wasn't unanimous. There was yelling. There were accusations. Someone threatened to call the police. Someone else tried to cut a deal in a low voice. But in the end, the evidence was overwhelming enough that the pieces began to move, in a direction that did not favor the man who had sold his respect for a title. I left that meeting exhausted, but with the feeling, for the first time in years, that my name would not be erased by someone else's whim. We raised a glass in silence. It wasn't a toast of triumph, it was an act of closing. I toasted my daughter, the childhood we had rescued, and the dignity that, however late, had found its voice again. As the first shadows of the evening blurred the windows, I thought about Teresa, her flaws and her tenderness, what united us and what tore us apart. The truth had exposed her. It had placed her in history exactly as she was. I didn't want anyone to hate her. I just wanted her to stop being used as a weapon. I went home, my hands empty, but my heart less constricted. My revenge had taken the form of justice. And justice, when it's exact, doesn't bring pleasure. It brings relief. I didn't get back the stolen years. I didn't erase the laughter that made me feel small. But I got back my name. And with it, the ability to look myself in the mirror again without the voice of an imposter confusing me. In the end, what this story leaves us with is a hard lesson. Love, trust, and dignity are fragile. And when they are betrayed, they leave deep scars. Sometimes justice is slow, but it always arrives. And what looked like a defeat can become a truth that sets you free. If this story moved you, I invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Remember to hit the notification bell, because every day we have new stories that touch the heart and invite us to reflect on life.